The first time someone laughed at the shed was on an autumn afternoon, when the air still carried a warm remnant of sunshine and no one really thought about winter. The structure was half-built, standing on thick pillars of treated wood, and it was already clear that this wouldn't be a simple extension. It was something bigger, something that defied known logic. A man passed by on the dirt road, looked up, and let out a short, dry laugh, like someone trying to fix something that was never broken. He said nothing, but the laugh was enough. Others came later with more direct, harsher comments. They said she was covering the house, as if she wanted to hide it, as if she were ashamed of what she had inherited. The protagonist heard everything from afar, her hands dirty with sawdust, her eyes fixed on the roofline that still needed adjusting. She didn't answer. She never answered. I knew that explaining wouldn't help, because the decision had already been made, and the judgment too. The shed made no sense to an outsider. It seemed too heavy, too extravagant, too expensive for someone living alone in an inherited house without prestige. The entire community operated under a silent code. Only what was necessary was done, nothing more. Firewood was piled outside, covered with black tarps, tied with old rope. That's how it had always been done. That's how it worked. Anything beyond that was waste, vanity, a sign of someone who didn't understand the basics of rural life. And there she was, building a structure that covered the entire house, rising almost 3 meters above the original roof, creating an empty and protected space between the wood and the tiles. To the neighbors, it was proof that she didn't know what she was doing. To her, it was the only way to ensure that when winter truly arrived, she wouldn't lack the essentials. The paradox was set. What seemed like madness could be exactly the opposite. The tension didn't come from shouts or direct confrontations. It came from the heavy silence that settled around that house. People stopped greeting her. They stopped asking if she needed anything. Isolation wasn't new to the protagonist, but now it had a different weight, a denser one, as if the community had decided she deserved to be alone with her absurd choice. When the shed was finished, at the end of autumn, no one went to see it up close. No one asked how it worked. The structure stood there, immense and strange, a silent symbol of everything that separated her from others. And then, without fanfare, without warning, winter began to descend upon those old houses, upon those rigid certainties, upon that collective pride that didn't yet know what was to come. The community stretched across a narrow valley, surrounded by low hills covered in dark pine trees that seemed more black than green when the sky turned gray. The houses were old, built of heavy wood and stone, erected decades ago by people who knew how to work with their hands and didn't trust in new things. The ground was packed earth in the main streets, and the wind that descended from the mountains always carried a smell of resin and dampness, even on dry days. In autumn, the leaves fell and formed orange carpets that no one swept, because soon the snow would cover everything anyway. It was a beautiful place in its own way, but also harsh, closed off, accustomed to functioning within unwritten rules that everyone knew and no one questioned. Those who lived there knew that winter wasn't a season, it was a test, and those who failed the test would pay dearly. The protagonist lived on the edge of the community, in a house that had belonged to her grandparents and was now hers alone. The building was simple, one story with thick walls and small windows that let in little light. The floor creaked in places, and the exterior paint had already peeled in several spots. But the structure was solid. She had inherited that house, along with the loneliness that came with it. Since becoming alone, she had learned to fix what broke, to carry what weighed her down, and not to expect help from anyone. Not out of pride, but out of experience. Help came with conditions, with opinions, with the obligation to listen to unsolicited advice. She preferred silence. She preferred to solve things her way, even if it meant making mistakes on her own. At least that way, when something worked out, it was hers. She held no position of prestige. She wasn't the daughter of anyone important. She didn't own enough land to be respected. She wasn't part of the groups that gathered at church or the general store. The older women treated her with distant politeness, like greeting someone who isn't part of the circle. The men ignored her, or worse, looked at her with that mixture of pity and disdain reserved for those who have no husband, no family, no one to speak for them. She knew this. I felt it every time I needed to buy something in town, every time I crossed paths with someone on the road and received a quick wave without conversation. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was social, emotional, invisible, but heavy as snow piled up on a weak roof. Even so, she observed. She watched the winters pass, watched the families struggle against the cold, watched the firewood piled outside the houses, always covered by tarpaulins that the wind ripped away, always exposed to the dampness rising from the ground. She watched the men splitting wood at the last minute, watched the women complaining that the fire wouldn't catch properly, that the smoke came back up the chimney, that the house never got warm enough. She observed and kept it all. She didn't talk about what she saw, but she recorded every detail, every repeated mistake, every problem that could have been avoided. And then, in a particularly difficult winter, when her own firewood got wet and she spent 3 nights shivering under blankets, she made a decision. She wouldn't repeat that. Never again. The house sat on slightly elevated land, which helped with drainage but didn't protect it from snow or wind. There was enough space around it to build something if she wanted to, and she did. The idea was born slowly, over months of observation and silent planning. It wouldn't be an ordinary barn. It wouldn't be a remote storage shed. It would be something that solved the problem at its root, keeping the firewood dry, accessible, and protected, no matter how much it snowed. The solution she envisioned seemed simple in theory, but brutal in execution. A shed large enough to cover the entire house, built on external pillars, creating an elevated and ventilated space where the firewood could be stacked without ever touching the wet ground. The house would be below, protected. The firewood would be above, dry, and she wouldn't have to go out in the cold to get something to burn. It made sense to her, only to her. The decision to build the shed wasn't announced. It simply began. One early autumn morning, when the air was still warm and the sky clear, the protagonist marked out the land around the house with wooden stakes and stretched rope. 4 main pillars, 2 on each side, spaced far enough apart not to touch the exterior walls. The foundation would be concrete, buried deep to withstand the weight of the structure and the pressure of the snow. She worked alone for the first few weeks, digging the holes, mixing cement, raising the main beams with a pulley system she improvised using thick ropes and a nearby tree. The work was hard, slow, but methodical. Every movement seemed to have been thought out beforehand. She didn't waste energy. She didn't rush anything. She knew she would have time until winter, and she also knew that no one would come to help. When the first pillar stood, solid and level, she paused for a moment and looked up. This was going to work. It had to work. The first reactions came quickly. A neighbor passing by stopped his truck, got out, walked to the fence, and stood there looking. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just observed the pillars, their height, the distance between them. Then he let out a short laugh and commented that it looked like something someone who had never seen a real winter would do. He said she was wasting good wood, that the weight of a shed that size could crack the house's foundation, that accumulated snow on top would become a bigger problem than wet firewood. She thanked him for his concern, but it didn't change anything. He left shaking his head. Then others came, older men who knew construction, who had worked with wood for decades. They all said the same thing. It was an exaggeration. Firewood didn't need a shed. It was enough to stack it properly, cover it with tarps, leave it for ventilation. As it had always been done. The harshest reaction came from one of the most respected women in the community, someone whose opinion carried weight in collective decisions. She appeared one afternoon, accompanied by 2 others, and stood in front of the construction site with her arms crossed. He didn't shout, didn't insult, but made it clear that this was a disgrace. He said that the protagonist was making a fool of herself, wasting money and time on something that nobody needed, that nobody asked for, that nobody would respect. He said that if she had difficulty with firewood, it was because she didn't know how to stack it properly, not because the traditional method was bad. The other women silently agreed with small nods. The protagonist listened to everything without interrupting, her hands dirty with grease, sweat dripping down her forehead. When they finished, she simply said that she would continue, that she appreciated the visit, but that the decision had already been made. The women left visibly irritated. From that day on, the protagonist ceased to exist for them. The perceived risk wasn't just technical, it was social. Building that shed meant publicly declaring that the old methods weren't enough, that collective experience was wrong, that she, alone and without authority, knew more than entire generations. No one said it in those words, but everyone felt it. The community functioned on a basis of mutual trust and tested practices. Questioning those practices was questioning the group's identity, and she was doing exactly that, with every beam erected, with every plank nailed. The shed became a symbol of silent arrogance. People passed by the house and pointed, commented amongst themselves, laughed. They said that when winter came, she would see the mistake. They said the shed would collapse, or worse, that it would function so badly that she would have to dismantle everything and apologize. The expectation wasn't that she would succeed. It was that she would fail loudly enough to serve as a lesson. But she didn't stop. She worked throughout the autumn, alone, silent, relentless. The shed grew until it covered the entire house, a structure of wood and metal that seemed disproportionate, heavy, strange. The roof had a steep slope to prevent snow accumulation. The sides had strategic openings for cross-ventilation. The interior floor was raised, made of spaced slats so that air could circulate under the firewood. Every detail seemed exaggerated, but nothing was random. When the shed was finished, she began to stack the firewood. Tons of dry wood, split in the summer, cured in the sun, now protected from the ground, the rain, the snow. The pile grew until it occupied half the interior space. And then, with the first winter chill knocking at the door, she locked the shed, reinforced the house's insulation, and waited. The community also waited, but for very different reasons. The construction of the pillars took 3 full weeks. Each one needed to be buried at least 1.5 meters deep below the frost line to ensure stability even when the ground hardened with the cold. The protagonist dug the holes by hand, using an old shovel and a rusty pickaxe she found in her grandparents' shed. The ground was hard, full of small stones that needed to be removed one by one. Her hands became calloused. Her back ached at the end of each day, but she didn't stop. She mixed the concrete in small batches, using a wooden wheelbarrow and a hoe, poured it into the holes, and carefully leveled it. Each pillar was made of treated wood, cut into a square section of 20 by 20 centimeters, strong enough to withstand the weight of the roof and the accumulated snow. She fixed the pillars in the still damp concrete, tied them with wire, and checked the plumb with a spirit level that had belonged to her grandfather. The work was slow but precise. Nothing could be crooked. The main beams were erected using a system she designed herself. She used thick sisal ropes, improvised pulleys made from pieces of metal and wood, and the strength of a thick tree located a few meters from the house. She tied the beam to the end of the rope, pulled slowly and raised it centimeter by centimeter until the piece was at the right height. Then, climbing a wooden ladder that creaked with every step, she fitted the beam into the notches she had made in the pillars, nailed it with long steel nails, and reinforced it with thick screws. Each beam weighed more than 50 kilos. Lifting one alone took almost an hour. Lifting them all took 2 weeks. When the main structure was finished, she looked up and saw for the first time the skeleton of what would become the shed. It seemed fragile from afar, but up close it was solid, immovable, capable of withstanding much more than anyone imagined. The roof was the most complex part. She chose a steep slope, almost 40 degrees, to ensure the snow would slide to the sides instead of accumulating on top. She used corrugated metal sheets, fastened with self-tapping screws that she tightened by hand, one by one, using a screwdriver that was worn down by the end of the job. The sheets overlapped by at least 15 centimeters, creating a waterproof barrier against rain and snow. She sealed the joints with heat-resistant silicone, smoothing them with a wet finger to ensure there would be no seepage. The sound of the sheets hitting the wood echoed through the valley. Some neighbors heard it and shook their heads. It seemed more and more like a useless fortress. But she continued, methodical, silent, unhurried. The sides of the shed received special treatment. Instead of closing everything completely, she left strategic openings, protected by spaced wooden slats that prevented snow from entering but allowed air circulation. Cross-ventilation was essential to prevent mold and dampness. The firewood needed to breathe, even when protected. She calculated the position of the openings based on the direction of the prevailing winds, which always came from the north during the winter. She left the south side more closed, the north side more open. She installed thin metal screens in the openings to prevent small animals from entering and seeking shelter in the shed. Every detail seemed obsessive, but it made sense within the logic she was building. Nothing was decorative, everything had a function. The interior floor of the shed was built on top of the existing house structure, but without directly touching it. She used secondary beams supported by external pillars, creating a second elevated level. She nailed spaced wooden slats onto these beams, leaving at least 5 centimeters between each one. This spacing allowed air to circulate under the firewood, preventing moisture from the ground from rising and wetting the wood. It was a functional floor, unfinished but perfectly suited to its purpose. She tested its strength by stepping on it in various places, jumping and applying weight. The floor did not give way. It was firm. It was ready to receive tons of firewood without risk of collapse. The firewood was stacked using a scientific method. She started with the interior walls of the shed, creating vertical rows that served as structural support for the following layers. Each log was placed perpendicular to the previous one, forming a crisscross pattern that distributed the weight evenly and allowed air circulation between the pieces. The larger logs were placed at the bottom, the smaller ones at the top. She separated the firewood by type: oak for long burns, pine for quick lighting, birch for intense heat. Each pile had its function. It wasn't just storage, it was logistics. When winter came, she would know exactly where each type of wood was, how long each would last, and how to combine the burns to maintain a stable heat. The pile grew until it occupied almost all the available space. From afar, it looked chaotic. Up close, it was pure organization. She also reinforced the house's insulation from the inside. He nailed thermal blankets to the interior walls, covered windows with thick woolen curtains, and sealed gaps in the doors with rubber strips he cut from old tire inner tubes. The fireplace was thoroughly cleaned. She climbed onto the roof and checked the chimney, removed bird nests, scraped off accumulated creosote, and ensured the draft was perfect. He installed a metal grate at the base of the fireplace to improve air circulation and increase combustion efficiency. Each improvement was small, but together they formed an integrated heating system that would be far more efficient than any ordinary house in the region. She knew it. Nobody else did. When everything was finished at the end of October, the shed seemed like an anomaly in the landscape. It was too big, too strange, too disproportionate for a simple house inhabited by a single woman. People passed by, looked, commented. They said it would collapse with the first heavy snowfall. They said the metal would freeze and crack. They said the ventilation would let in snow. They said she had wasted months of work on something that wouldn't work. The protagonist listened to the comments from afar, carried the last bundle of firewood into the shed, locked the door with a heavy padlock, and entered the house. Inside, she lit the fireplace for the first time that season. The fire caught quickly. The firewood was dry, cured, perfect. The smoke rose up the chimney without hesitation. The heat spread through the rooms with surprising efficiency. She sat near the fire and waited. Winter was coming, and she was ready. If you're following this story, please subscribe to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be shared, and your subscription helps us continue bringing these narratives to you. Winter arrived slowly, almost politely at first. The first frosts appeared in November, covering the fields with a thin layer of white crystals that melted at midday. The air became drier, sharper, carrying the smell of wood smoke rising from the chimneys. The people of the community lit their stoves, checked their piles of wood stacked outside, adjusted the tarpaulins covering the mounds. Everything seemed normal, controlled as expected. The older men commented that it would be a typical winter, perhaps even milder than the previous one. There was no reason to worry. The usual routine would suffice. The children played in the fine snow that was beginning to fall, and the women prepared preserves in the heated kitchens. It was the beginning of another cycle, familiar and predictable, with no signs that anything different was to come. The first heavy snowfall came in the second week of November. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to cover the ground with 20 centimeters of compacted snow that didn't melt the next day. The cold settled in more strongly, and the temperature began to drop below zero even during the day. The tarpaulins covering the piles of firewood became heavy with the accumulation of snow. Some neighbors had to climb ladders to clear the tops of the piles, pushing the snow to the sides, retensioning the ropes that held the tarpaulins. It was tedious work, but necessary. Nobody complained much. It was part of winter. It had always been like that. The protagonist observed from afar, from her house window, watching the neighbors dealing with the accumulated snow. Her shed was silent, motionless, its sloping roof already cleared by gravity itself. The snow slid to the sides, fell to the ground, and didn't accumulate on top. She didn't need to do anything. Minor problems began to appear in the third week. The snow that fell overnight partially melted during the day, creating a layer of water that ran down under the tarps and wet the base of the woodpiles. The wood in direct contact with the ground began to absorb moisture. It wasn't a serious problem yet, because the top of the piles remained dry, but it was a sign. Some people noticed that the firewood took longer to catch fire, produced more smoke at the beginning of the burn, and that the heat was less intense. They adjusted the way they stacked the wood, raised the base with old boards, and reinforced the tarps. These were practical, tested solutions, sufficient for most winters. No one was alarmed, just attentive. The protagonist, for her part, entered the shed every morning and found the firewood exactly as she had left it, dry, clean, and protected. The raised floor prevented any contact with the moisture from the ground. Cross-ventilation kept the air circulating. Everything worked as planned. The wind began to change in the fourth week. It became more constant, colder, coming directly from the north with gusts that made the windows tremble. The tarpaulins over the piles of firewood began to come loose, torn by the gusts, ripped off by the knots that gave way. The neighbors went out several times a day to replace the tarpaulins, tie them again, secure them with stones or bricks. It was tiring, repetitive, irritating work. Some began to complain openly, saying that this winter was proving more laborious than usual. Others tried to improvise solutions, using more ropes, building wooden structures to hold the tarpaulins in place. The protagonist saw all this happening while carrying firewood from the shed into the house. She didn't need to go out in the wind. She didn't need to fight against tarpaulins. She simply opened the shed door, took what she needed, and went back. The contrast was becoming visible, but still no one commented directly. Pride still held them back. The temperature continued to drop. By the end of November, thermometers registered 15 degrees below zero at night. Piles of exposed firewood began to partially freeze, the absorbed moisture turning to ice between the wood fibers. When people tried to split new firewood, the axes ricocheted, the wood resisted, and the blows needed to be stronger. Burning became even more difficult. The wet, frozen firewood produced weak fire, dense smoke, and insufficient heat. Some houses began to cool down at night, forcing families to use more blankets, sleep fully clothed, and ration wood to ensure it lasted until the end of winter. Tension began to rise, but it was still manageable. It was still possible to continue with traditional methods, provided they were adjusted, reinforced, and constantly monitored. No one admitted it aloud, but everyone knew. This winter was different, and it was only the beginning. December brought the real cold. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero at night and rarely rose above zero during the day. The snow that fell now was different, dry, fine, merciless, accumulating in compact layers that wouldn't melt. The wind blew constantly, creating mounds of snow against the walls of houses, blocking doors, burying the piles of firewood outside. People in the community began to realize that this was no ordinary winter. The tarps over the firewood became useless. The snow seeped in from underneath, from the sides, accumulating between the logs. The exposed wood absorbed moisture during the day, when the weak sun tried to melt the surface, and froze again at night. The cycle of wetting and freezing made the firewood increasingly difficult to use. Fires took a long time to catch, produced acrid smoke that came back up the chimneys, and provided little warmth. The houses began to cool alarmingly. The first signs of despair appeared in the informal meetings held at the village store. Men who had once been confident began to admit difficulties. They spoke in hushed voices about firewood that wouldn't burn properly, about nights when the fire went out before dawn, about children waking up cold. The women exchanged recipes on how to dry wet firewood near the stove, how to use less wood to produce more heat, how to dress the children in layers. These were practical conversations, but laden with worry. No one panicked yet, but everyone felt they were fighting something bigger than expected. The entire community was working double shifts just to keep the basics running, and winter was far from over. Some looked at the protagonist's house, saw the dense, constant smoke rising from the chimney, but no one commented. Pride was still stronger than curiosity. The snow continued to fall throughout the first week of December. It didn't stop. It fell during the night, during the day, accumulating 1/2 meter, then more. The piles of firewood outside the houses were completely buried. People had to dig with shovels to reach the wood, and what they found was soaked, frozen, almost unusable. Some tried to improvise shelters on top of the piles, using old planks and pieces of metal, but the snow accumulated on top and collapsed, taking everything away. Others tried to move the firewood inside the houses, but there wasn't enough space. The kitchens were crammed with wet wood that dripped onto the floor, creating dark puddles that froze overnight. The smell of mold began to spread. The houses became damp, cold, uncomfortable. Winter was winning. The situation worsened when the pipes began to freeze. Without sufficient heat during the night, the water that remained stagnant in the pipes turned to ice, expanded, and cracked the pipes. Several houses woke up without running water. People had to melt snow in pans on the stoves, a slow and laborious process that consumed even more firewood. A vicious cycle set in. Less heat meant more problems meant more work meant less time to solve the central issue, which was the wet firewood. Families began to ration severely. They burned wood only in one room, keeping the rest of the house closed and cold. They all slept together in the living room, near the stove, under all the blankets they had. The children began to get sick, with persistent dry coughs and low-grade fevers. Fear began to replace confidence. In the second week of December, the temperature reached 25 degrees below zero overnight. Some families simply couldn't keep their fires burning until dawn. The wet firewood produced weak flames that died out during the night, leaving their homes plunged into brutal cold. People woke up shivering with numb fingers and aching bones. They began burning old furniture, pieces of fence, anything that could produce heat. The dry wood from the structures burned quickly, hot, but didn't last. It was a desperate, unsustainable solution. Everyone knew they couldn't continue like this for much longer. Winter still had months to go, and the remaining firewood, buried in the snow, was becoming increasingly useless. The entire community began to understand that they had made a mistake. Not in the way they stacked the firewood, not in the amount of wood stored, but in something more fundamental, something no one had considered before. The contrast with the protagonist's house became impossible to ignore. While the other chimneys emitted weak, irregular smoke, hers produced a dense, constant column of dark smoke that rose straight to the sky. Her fire never failed. It never died out during the night. It never produced smoke that returned. The house remained warm, the windows fogged by the internal heat, while all the others around showed windows covered in ice from the inside. Some people began to pass by on the road just to look. They didn't speak to her. They didn't ask anything, but they observed. They observed the enormous shed that covered the house, the snow sliding down the sides of the sloping roof, the padlock closed on the door. They began to understand that this was not an exaggeration. It was foresight. It was preparation. It was the difference between being ready and being wrong. Social tension reached a critical point when one of the community's most traditional homes began to face serious problems. It belonged to the family of one of the men who had most ridiculed the protagonist, someone who had lived there for decades and prided himself on knowing every detail of rural life. His woodpile was completely unusable. Buried, wet, frozen, he tried everything: digging, drying near the fire, burning green wood. Nothing worked properly. His house began to get dangerously cold. His young children started coughing incessantly. His wife stopped talking to him, only staring blankly at the extinguished fireplace. One night, he went out, walked through the snow to the protagonist's house, and stood in front of the shed for almost 10 minutes. He didn't knock, he didn't call. He just stood there in the cold, looking at the structure he himself had ridiculed months before. Then he returned home in silence, but something had broken. The following morning, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Several houses awoke without fire. People went out into the streets, desperate, searching for solutions. Some tried to borrow firewood from neighbors, but everyone was in the same situation. There was no dry firewood anywhere. There was no way to produce enough heat. Winter had brutally and definitively defeated traditional methods. And then, for the first time, someone knocked on the protagonist's door. Not to ridicule, not to criticize, but to ask for help. Collective pride began to crack, like ice under pressure, and the reversal was about to happen. And if you've been following along this far, realizing how small decisions can change everything, you might want to subscribe. Real stories of preparedness and survival continue to be shared on this channel. The first person to knock on the door was an older woman, a mother of 3 small children, someone who, weeks before, had said that the shed was a waste of wood. She arrived at dawn with snow up to her knees, her face red with cold and shame. She didn't say much. She only asked if the protagonist could sell or lend her some dry firewood. Her voice was low, trembling, laden with a humiliation she tried to hide, but which showed through in every word. The protagonist didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She simply nodded, opened the shed, separated a bundle of dry oak firewood, tied it with rope, and handed it over. She didn't charge anything. She only said she hoped it would help. The woman held the bundle against her chest, thanked her in a low voice, and left quickly, as if she wanted to disappear before anyone saw her there. But others had already seen her, and others were coming. During the day, 3 more people appeared. A young man who lived alone and hadn't prepared enough firewood, a family with a sick, elderly person who needed constant warmth, a couple who had lost half their woodpile when the wind knocked down the makeshift structure they had built. They all arrived with the same expression: shame, despair, and anticipated gratitude. The protagonist treated them all the same way, without judgment, without demands, without comments about the past. She simply opened the shed, separated the firewood, and handed it over. She didn't make speeches. She didn't apologize for being ridiculed. She simply helped. The shed that had been the subject of jokes was now the only source of truly dry firewood in the entire community. And the protagonist, who had been treated as foolish, was now seen as someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The shift in social perception was rapid, but not universal. Some people still resisted. They preferred to burn furniture, use green wood, endure the cold, anything but admit they had been wrong. Pride was hard to break, especially among the older generation, those who had taught entire generations how to survive in the countryside. Admitting that a woman alone, without recognized experience, without authority, had thought better than they had was unbearable. But reality didn't care about pride. The cold didn't negotiate. And when the children began to truly fall ill, when the houses became dangerously cold, when the fear of not surviving the winter became real, pride began to give way. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but little by little, silently, person by person. Late in the afternoon, the man who had publicly ridiculed the protagonist, the one who had stood in front of the shed for 10 minutes days before, returned. This time he knocked on the door. When she opened it, he stood there speechless, staring at the snow-covered ground. It took him a few seconds to speak. He said he was wrong. that he shouldn't have laughed, that he shouldn't have doubted, that he needed help because his children were sick and the house was no longer warm. His voice broke at the end. The protagonist saw a proud man crumble before her, not from weakness, but from love for his children. She didn't hesitate. She gathered 2 large bundles of firewood, the best she had, and handed them to him. She told him he didn't need to apologize. She simply told him to take care of the children. He took the firewood, thanked her with eyes full of frozen tears, and left. The reversal was complete. The community had learned in the hardest way possible that preparation was worth more than tradition. The worst night of winter arrived without warning. The temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, a cold no one in the community had experienced in decades. The wind blew with brutal force, creating an even lower wind chill, tearing off roof tiles, breaking tree branches that crackled like gunshots in the darkness. By 7 o'clock at night, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary night. Several houses simply couldn't retain enough heat. The stoves burned what remained of dry firewood, but it wasn't enough. The icy walls sucked away the heat. The cracks let in glacial drafts. The rooms cooled down minutes after the fire weakened. Children cried from the cold. The elderly shivered under every available blanket, and families realized they wouldn't reach dawn safely. That's when they began to move towards the only house that still had real warmth. The first family arrived at 8 o'clock in the evening. They knocked urgently on the door, carrying 2 small children wrapped in blankets. The father quickly explained that their fire had gone out and they couldn't relight it, that the firewood was too wet, and that the house was freezing. The protagonist didn't hesitate. She opened the door completely and told them to come in. The house was warm, almost suffocating compared to the cold outside. The fireplace burned with high, steady flames, fueled by dry oak wood that produced dense, lasting heat. The children stopped crying as soon as they felt the warmth. The mother began to remove their wet layers of clothing, trembling not from cold, but from relief. The protagonist got clean blankets, prepared hot tea, and indicated places near the fire. She asked no questions. She simply welcomed them. 15 minutes later, another family knocked on the door. Then another, and another. In less than an hour, there were 12 people inside the house. Children, adults, 2 elderly people. All came from homes that could no longer maintain enough heat to survive the night. The protagonist organized the space as best she could. She placed the children closest to the fire, the elderly in comfortable chairs, the adults sitting on mats on the floor. The house was cramped, but no one complained. The important thing was the warmth, and the warmth was abundant, constant, reliable. The fireplace never weakened because the protagonist had enough firewood to fuel it all night. She went into the shed every hour, got more firewood, returned, and put it on the fire. The system that everyone ridiculed was saving lives, and everyone inside knew it. Throughout the night, the protagonist kept the fire burning without interruption. She used oak firewood for long burns, alternating with birch when she needed more intense heat, and controlled the chimney draft to optimize efficiency. Every technical detail she had planned months before now proved its worth. The raised floor of the shed kept the firewood completely dry. Cross-ventilation prevented mold, and organization by wood type allowed for quick and efficient selection. She didn't need to go out in the brutal cold to retrieve firewood buried in the snow. She didn't need to try to dry wet wood. She didn't need to improvise. Everything was ready. Everything worked. People watched in silence as she worked, realizing that each movement was the result of careful preparation, not luck. The children fell asleep near the fire, finally warm and safe. The adults spoke in hushed voices, exchanging stories about how dangerous the night was outside, about how they had tried everything before coming to ask for help. The man who had ridiculed the protagonist sat in the corner, observing the fireplace with a thoughtful expression. At a certain point, he looked at her and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she had been right from the beginning, that the shed was no exaggeration, that it was exactly what everyone should have done, that he regretted having doubted. Others agreed. The protagonist simply nodded without needing to elaborate. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at being right, just the calm of someone who had done what needed to be done and was now seeing the results. Night wore on, and the cold outside intensified even more. The wind howled against the walls, snow beat against the windows, but inside the house the warmth remained steady. The protagonist constantly checked the fire, adjusted the firewood, and ensured no one was cold. She served more tea, distributed extra blankets, and spoke softly to the worried mothers. She was no longer the stranger who lived alone and did absurd things. She was the person who had taken them in when no one else could help. She was the person whose silent preparation was making the difference between safety and real danger. The shed above the house, that structure everyone had ridiculed, now protected not only firewood, but lives. And the lesson was clear to everyone inside. Preparation is not an exaggeration when the threat is real. Dawn arrived slowly, with a pale, cold light that barely managed to pierce the heavy clouds. The temperature was still brutally low, but the worst was over. The families who had spent the night at the protagonist's house began to get up, check on the children, and prepare to return. Before leaving, each offered their thanks in a different way. Some with emotional words, others with silent hugs, others simply with looks that said it all. The man who had ridiculed the shed was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, turned, and said he was going to build something similar in his own home, that he would never again depend on methods that failed when they were most needed. The protagonist simply nodded, wished him good luck, and closed the door. Outside, winter continued, but something fundamental had changed in the community. In the following weeks, the shed ceased to be a source of jokes and became a practical reference. Other families began planning similar structures for the following year. Not exact copies, but adaptations based on the same principle, protecting the firewood from moisture, raising it off the ground, ensuring ventilation, preparing before winter arrived. The conversations at the store changed tone. Now they talked about roof pitch, batten spacing, types of wood for pillars. The protagonist was consulted occasionally, always respectfully, never intrusively. She answered simply, shared what she knew, but did not assume an authoritative role. She didn't need to. The shed spoke for her. The winter that everyone survived spoke for her. Her position in the community changed without a single official word being spoken. She continued to live alone, living simply, but now she was no longer invisible. She was respected, and that was enough. Winter ended in March, leaving behind fields covered in dirty snow that melted slowly under a still, weak sun. The community counted the damage: torn tiles, cracked pipes, downed fences. But no one had died. No one had suffered severe hypothermia. The children who fell ill recovered. And everyone knew that if it weren't for the shed and the silent preparation of a woman they had ridiculed, the story could have been very different. The lesson remained etched in the collective memory, not as an explicit moral, but as a lived experience. Silent preparation was worth more than collective approval. What seemed like an exaggeration had saved lives, and tradition without reflection failed precisely when it was most needed. The protagonist continued living as she always had, but now she carried something new. Not public recognition, but the inner certainty that she had made the right choice. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the difference between surviving and giving up lies in the decisions we make when no one is watching. If you want to keep up with stories like this, subscribe to the channel.